I'm delighted to be here to help moderate this conversation about drugs and about legalizing drugs, or whether we should or shouldn't. We have two very distinguished guests this evening who know a great deal about this topic and who will have an interesting conversation between them. And then I have some questions to ask of them. But I want to begin actually by complimenting the students who organize these debates to begin with.
Indeed.
It is, I think, a rare occasion on many college campuses these days when you have open and honest and respectful debates. We need more, not less, of this, and I think that's a compliment to the students who inspired this, and to Dan Gordon, their fearless leader, who is helping to organize these gatherings, and I look forward to participating in many more of them in the months to come. So let me begin by introducing our two guests. To my left is Jeffrey Miron. He is the Director of Economic Studies at the Cato Institute and the Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Department of Economics at Harvard University. His area of expertise is the economics of libertarianism, with a particular emphasis on the economics of illegal drugs. He has served on the faculty of the University of Michigan and as a visiting professor at the Sloan School of Management at MIT, and of course at the Econ Department at Harvard. From 1992 to 1998, he was the chair of the Department of Economics at Boston University, so he has worked for many of our rivals. Welcome to the best here at UMass. He is the author of Drug War Crimes, The Consequences of Prohibition, about which I will have some questions, and The Economics of Seasonal Cycles, in addition to many op-eds and journal articles. He has been a recipient of the Olin Fellowship from the National Bureau of Economic Research, an Earhart Foundation Fellowship, and a Sloan Foundation Faculty Research Fellowship. He took his BA, magna cum laude, from Swarthmore College in 1979, and his doctorate in economics from MIT in 1984. And on my right, in the other corner, so to speak, is David Murray. He is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, where he co-directs the Center for Substance Abuse Policy Research. And while serving in previous posts as the chief scientist and associate deputy director in the federal government's Office of National Drug Control Policy, he directed extensive scientific research on all aspects of the drug problem and helped to coordinate high-level interagency efforts to limit the production of illicit drugs and counter the transnational criminal organizations that control the global shipment and marketing of illegal substances. Before entering government, David Murray was the executive director of the Statistical Assessment Service, and he held academic appointments at Connecticut College, Brown University, Brandeis, and Georgetown. He, too, is the author of many scholarly papers, essays, and commentaries, and the co-author with Joel Schwartz and Robert Lichter of the widely noted book, It Ain't Necessarily So: How Media Make and Unmake the Scientific Picture of Reality. This is something about which we have a great deal to learn these days. He holds the MA and PhD in social anthropology from the University of Chicago. We are delighted to have you both here at the University of Massachusetts. So I'm told that our colleagues have prepared some remarks to begin with, and we're going to let them do that, provide their comments, and then to ask some questions of one another about their comments, and then I will turn to some questions that the student leaders have prepared to ask you both, and then we'll open it up to the audience at the end. So why don't we begin with you?
Actually, we had a coin flip.
Oh, did you have a coin flip?
Dr. Murray won, so he's going first.
You're on.
Amazing bias shows itself, rears its head. Out of the blue, she just picks the person who lost the coin toss. What are the... Your Honor, we had a coin toss, and I managed to prevail. And here
By
I was
all means, please
plumbing
go
and
right
ready.
ahead.
I understand we have about 10 minutes
Yes,
to represent
that would
each
be
of our
perfect.
sides.
Yeah.
I've kind of tried to time myself. I have a tendency to speak a lot, but so bear with me. But
I'll watch
I'll
my
try to
watch.
be tight
Okay.
and keep an eye on it. But I got to go first, and in fairness to Jeffrey, who no doubt will be able to give his own characterization of the argument for is there a right to use drugs in the libertarian posture, I wanted to at least characterize so you would understand my counters and my remarks or my questions, what I take up as some of the central postulates of that perspective, that what it is that they do claim, and try to say that try to do so relatively fairly. I went to Doug Bando, a Cato Institute fellow who wrote a recent paper, 2012, I think, for Fraser. And I just found some of the arguments in there. If there is a right to use drugs, it seems to depend on the following postulates or underpinnings for its argument. The notion of personal autonomy or freedom is really quite central. What actions that society might restrict of the individual? Well, Bando says the fundamental moral premise of our political, economic, and legal systems is that the individual is competent to order his life, to manage his own affairs, to be responsible for whatever results. What about criminality? What things are wrong that must be prohibited? Well, he says, for libertarians such as himself, importantly, the use of drugs does not fall into the category of those things which are wrong, nor does it fall into the category of those things which do great harm to others, which would be criminal. If morality is involved, he says, it is of a different kind. It is soul molding, which is rather hard to say. By this standard, he asks, is drug use immoral? No, there is nothing inherent to the act of using drugs that is immoral or wrong or criminal. No basis for any criticism of the simple desire to gain pleasure. Therefore, he says, we hold the government may not properly criminalize drug use. In essence, the right of the individual to do as he pleases takes precedence over the good of the individual. In this way, drug use reflects an informed choice, a choice. That's the realm of morality. Contrary to popular assumptions, the vast majority of drug users enjoy productive and balanced lives. 52,404 dead Americans in 2015 from opioid overdose and drug-induced deaths. Probably had theirs ended soon, but that could be true. Then he asked, if consumption does not warrant jail, why should those who make it possible for people to consume have to go to jail as well? That would be, in my vernacular, dealers. All right, I'm being a little sarcastic, but that is the way he argues it, and it has a trenchantcy. And then the other side would be a clearly moral argument, and he has the good wit and the fairness to bring forward sociologist James Q. Wilson, who says, in another perspective, drug use is wrong because it is immoral, and it is immoral because it enslaves the mind and destroys the soul. But Bando has an answer. He says, look, a behavior that enslaves the mind and destroys the soul, quote, would seem to be wrong, an affront to the value and dignity of the human person. But even if so, we say, such behavior is not the proper province of government and especially the criminal law. Contrary to Aristotle, statecraft is not soulcraft. There's more. There's the utilitarian calculus, the laws of worsen the phenomenon, and so forth, and notions about what is harm reduction. But I want to say now, here are my questions, because I don't know the answers to whether drug using should be a right. But here are the kinds of things that trouble me. What are rights? Where we find legal or political rights, we find concordant responsibilities. As in Roman law, father has rights over the child. They're total for life. I mean, patria potestas. Rights and powers over the child, but at the same time also has duties and responsibilities in regards to the child. If there is a right to use drugs that accrues to individuals, what are those obligations or duties that would be commensurate that attach to the exercise of that right? Are there any? Duties to the self, duties to others in the community. If drug use were a right, it could not indeed be infringed, could it? We would need to, well, we could, but only after establishing a compelling state interest, as we do with other rights, where the state has to demonstrate compelling interest to invoke a legal prohibition. I would hold in contrast to the initial presumptions of the autonomy argument that we, in fact, are different. We are social beings in the first instance. We are autonomous individuals, but not just that, and I'm not sure the degree of autonomy if it's total. And this is the proper condition, in fact, of our liberty. Further, that drug use damages that self and the social directly and causally, and that the harm is sufficient to require it to be controlled by law. Society, properly seen, is a victim of drug use and may protect itself, just as society has a duty to those in need of our protection who are damaging their self. In exercising societal rights and duties, we find the presence of law and justice, the very conditions of liberty. When someone is murdered, why is there a trial? the person's gone, because we don't have a law of lex talionis. It's not civil law, it's criminal law. What is the injured party? Society that is injured. It is society that brings the case by the murder. In that sense. Now, while the foundation of strictly political liberty in our governmental system may well be the autonomous, rational individual acting with self-interest, but we also read that, but they are endowed somehow by inalienable rights from their creator. Now, if that's part of our governmental system, we may have additional, though contingent rights conferred by political order, but something is there about soulcraft. Such political rights are founded on a more profound, I would argue, and indelible foundation. They're founded on human personhood, derived moralistically, humanistically, religiously, however. That is to say, they are founded and derived from the community. You may hear an echo of Durkheim. Or Wittgenstein. They're a form of life, our community life. That is what we are as persons. Without that, we are not autonomous individuals. And for instance, is the autonomous individual really present in the circumstance of drug use? What if drug use is, as we now have the dominant model, a disease of the brain? Guess what gets compromised? Autonomy, rationality, the capacity to have self-interest, to protect oneself, to pursue things without damage, because it's a mental illness. If drug use causes disease, the very predicate of the right to use drugs argument is gone, the autonomous individual. That truly troubles me. Are we to renounce the disease model and say, well, we're just choosing pleasure, therefore it's not really, it doesn't, whoa, that's morality, isn't it? Well, what if drug use is, I mean, if it's a disease, is smallpox a right? We have a right to get it? Well, no, it's a little bit ridiculous, but nonetheless, it is mental illness of a sort. And the libertarian argument is commonly, those who choose poorly must suffer for it. The consequences, at least. It sounds like eugenics in many regards, but they made their choices, they weeded out. I mean, that's harsh, but nonetheless, that's how they're going to deal with the difficulty. Is it a disability? If drug use is an illness can be a disability, and disability has rights. Because you can go to your trial lawyer and say, I've got to drive a school bus. You can't prohibit me. I'm disabled. You can't say I have to take a drug test and fly an airplane. That becomes problematic for society, occurs to me, in terms of where that ends up. Do we have a right to pleasure? Bando says yes, or it's not the pursuit of happiness noticed by that. He said pleasure. But then do people have a responsibility to provide drugs? If someone has a right to drugs, does someone have a responsibility to provide them with the drugs? That would be the dealer, or it could be the government. In the case of medication-assisted therapy, where the government doles out, or in Canada, or in Switzerland, which I visited, drugs come from the government because there's a responsibility, because this is a disability and a mental illness, and we don't want them to hurt themselves, so we're going to give them the drugs. But what if the apparent pleasure that we're pursuing really is just a lie, a trap, a misrepresentation? It's not pleasure at all. It appears that way, like La Brea tar pits. The animals walk out on the water and they sink and die. That's what I watch. That's what I see happening regularly. People get trapped into addiction because it appears pleasurable at first and ends up casting them into a living hell for themselves and their families many times. Here, try this apple, said the snake. It'll give you knowledge, will not harm you. Oh, is there recovery? Yeah, I've met people in recovery who've come back, come home. Humans are redeemable. If they are redeemable, what impact do we make on them by having drugs be a right and more freely and readily available as they struggle? Where's their incentive? Where's the disincentive for treatment, for prevention efforts, for deterrence? When we say, no, we're going to make them widely available, easy to get because it's a right, you got the right. We lose those people, and they're stunned by this reality that half the government's working against their ability to redeem themselves. All right, time is going on. I need to get to these last two things. So a question from a social perspective. Do we have a moral, two more, and I'll be done. Do we have a moral responsibility to the sick? Socially, I would say, absolutely. They're ours, part of us. No one needs laws to prohibit strychnine consumption. It's not attractive, but drugs of abuse as substances are similarly poisons. And we have a responsibility to those who are poisoned by these things. Why do we have laws against suicide? What is our responsibility to those caught in their own private hell? The answer depends to some degree on the etiology, the cause of their being in that condition. If the condition has a socioeconomic cause, then our responsibility presumably is socioeconomic. Help those who are impoverished. If it is stigma that causes their suffering, then, or them to use drugs, then let's be Rousseau, eliminate the judgments and stigma in the law. But if it's a medical condition, then the answer must be medical treatment. Remove the pathogens, stop the supply, stop the infections, the vectors of disease. That's the medical response. But what if it's a moral responsibility? Then the answer has to be a moral imperative. Maybe it's several of these things at once. But if without this last dimension, we are a social order red in tooth and claw. For those who argue a right to use drugs, tell us we do not have this responsibility. If it is a right, not only must it be permitted, but honored and protected. If we have a system of norms, and we have those who look on and evaluate for ourselves what is right, what is good, what is a person, and what are their purposes, what's their telos, what are their freedoms and the liberty of self-government, can we leave the state of that responsibility and duty to those others and pretend that we can keep the remainder, the edifice of a social order functioning that will no longer stand, I fear, if we cannot appropriately answer the Genesis 4:9 question when we learn, am I my brother's keeper? And what is our answer if self-destruction is a right? So I'll hold now.
So that's a heavy way to end, and we will come back to that question. Before I turn to our second speaker, I'm going to ask somebody to hand me my bag over there, because that's my phone going off, and I'm going to shut it off so that doesn't interrupt.
Again, subversion.
I apologize for the way that interrupted your comments. I'm going to shut it off.
I thought it was a heavenly choir.
Did you? Well, brought to you by iPhone.
All right.
Please, help us understand your point of view.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. Thank you to Dr. Murray for appearing with me. So the question that was posed for the debate is, do you have the right to do drugs? Now, as you'll see a little bit in my remarks and in probably lots of discussion, I tend not to discuss things so much in terms of rights. I tend to think in terms of consequences as an economist, but I've done my best to at least start by talking about the question that was posed and then relate it to a more consequentialist take on the issues related to drugs. So my answer, as you would guess, is yes, people have the right to use drugs, okay, and I'll give you 3 reasons. Okay? First, I would have posed the question differently or said the natural starting point was completely different than the way it was posed for us. I would say, why wouldn't every individual in a free society or a society that suggests that it's free or describes itself as free, why wouldn't every individual have the right to use drugs? In my definition, and I think a widespread definition of a free society, adults can do whatever they wish, regardless of the actions on themselves, except when their actions have some non-trivial, some significant impact on others. Now, it's of course true that under some circumstances, some individuals' use of drugs does adversely affect others. Driving under the influence would be an obvious example. But of course, there are zillions of products which, when misused by one individual, can adversely affect others. I was on a ski slope in Vermont, not very far from here, when someone on a snowboard was going too fast, okay, crashed into an elderly gentleman and killed that person. Okay? Nobody went from that to saying we should outlaw skiing. Okay? They didn't condemn all skiing. They condemned the irresponsible use of the snowboard in that particular instance. Much more broadly, people, of course, misuse alcohol, cigarettes, saturated fat, driving a car, innumerable other examples. Okay? But yet, we maintain that most people, okay, setting aside, for at least for now, children, setting aside perhaps people who have already committed some other crime, but mostly we regard adults as having the right to do all of those things, but not to misuse them in a way which harms somebody else. So from that perspective, the only reasonable rights position is that everyone has the right to do drugs, barring compelling evidence that use frequently or routinely or normally has undesired negative effects. In economist language, has negative spillovers or externalities on other people. And I'm sure Dr. Murray and I will debate this quite a bit, but in my assessment of the evidence, no such evidence that drugs necessarily or routinely or even typically cause such negative side effects, and therefore, of course, adults should have the right to use drugs. Now, a second perspective that I think is kind of interesting to talk about, won't by itself persuade very many people one way or the other, but when you talk about rights, you're tempted to think about the U.S. Constitution, which of course tries to guarantee certain rights to the people. The Ninth Amendment states, "The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people." So if you wanted to look to the Constitution as your guide to policy, as your guide to what rules and regulations our country should make, and you read the Ninth Amendment, I think you'd be tempted to say, tons and tons of individual rights to read whatever books you want, to engage in whatever consensual sexual activity you want, to use drugs, alcohol, etc., okay, is embedded quite clearly in the Ninth Amendment to the Constitution, part of the original Bill of Rights. Okay, and that would be one basis on which one might try to defend the notion that people have the right to use drugs. Now, a different way we could have phrased today's question would be then to say, if we don't have the right to use drugs, then what follows? If we don't have the right to use drugs, then presumably the next step for many people is, therefore, the government does have the right to intervene, to interfere, to limit individuals' use of drugs in at least some ways. Now, you could think that those interventions consisted of relatively mild things, such as a sin tax, as we have on alcohol, or public media campaigns discouraging teenagers from trying drugs and things like that. But we all, if we have a reasonable sense that those mild restrictions are certainly not going to prevent everyone from using drugs. They're not going to discourage very many people from using drugs very much. And so if you think the government has the right to prevent us from using drugs and the right to keep us from making mistakes, then you're led to the policy of prohibition. You're led to something like the current U.S. war on drugs. Okay? And I will suggest, briefly for now, that whatever you think about drug use, whether you think it's moral or not, unethical or not, against your religious or anybody else's religious convictions or not, whether you think it's good for your health or bad for your health, whatever you think about any of those direct effects of the use of drugs, prohibition of drugs is much worse for almost everyone in society. Why? First, the evidence is that, in fact, prohibition seems to be extremely ineffective at deterring irresponsible people from using and misusing drugs, from preventing the particular kinds of drug use which may harm other people or which may harm the individuals themselves in a significant way. And at the same time, it's not doing much to discourage those activities that most of us might want to discourage. Prohibition is creating black markets, crime, corruption, insurrection in other countries. It's limiting civil liberties in sort of breathtakingly sort of unpleasant ways. There was a great article in the New York Times this past weekend about the effect of the militarization of the police and no-knock warrants and how they've led to all sorts of excesses. More prosaically, drug prohibition is causing the U.S. governments as a whole, adding up state, federal, local, to spend $50 billion a year trying to enforce prohibition fairly ineffectively and forego maybe $50 billion in tax revenues that could be collected if drugs were legal like other products and taxed like other products. So whatever you think about the rights issue, if you were to switch the question somewhat and say, as a practical matter, which is worse, legalization or prohibition? Is the treatment worse than the disease? In my assessment, prohibition is much worse than any of the negatives that occur under